minimized by professionals, and that intimate partner violence was understood by professionals to be instances of physical assault rather than a pattern of coercion. The continuing restraints on women's freedom highlight the need for community and statutory services to work beyond risk-based interventions and to focus on support and interventions that help women and children feel safe post-separation. Here in North Tipperary, we are fortunate to have agencies working collaboratively to support women and children whose lives are or whose lives have been impacted by domestic violence and coercive control. And we see firsthand the importance of interagency working to provide a seamless and wraparound service to children and women affected by domestic violence. Services in North Tipperary are provided by Ascend Domestic Abuse Services for Women, which is coordinated by Kathleen Marr, and the Barnardos TLC KIDZ Project, which is coordinated by Margaret Carroll. We are also fortunate to have the National Coordinator for the Childhood Domestic Abuse Project based within the Barnardos TLC Project, with Anya Costello being the National Coordinator. Domestic violence and coercive control are not the preserve of domestic and gender-based violence services. It is everyone's responsibility. And it is great to see the numbers that are signed up to be part of this webinar this afternoon to hear the expert voice of Dr. Emma Katz. Dr. Emma Katz is a senior lecturer in childhood and youth at Liverpool Hope University. Her research investigates the impacts of domestic violence and abuse on mothers, children and young people, exploring coercive control, agency, resistance, recovery, and mother-child supportiveness in the domestic abuse context. Emma's work has received international recognition, winning both Women Against Violence Europe's Karina Seth Prize and the Wiley Prize for the best article published in the Child Abuse Review in 2015 to 2018. Now, as a preamble to Emma's presentation, we will show a 1-minute video from the often unheard voice in domestic violence, that being the voice of the child. This video was produced by Barnardos in collaboration with domestic abuse services around Ireland. In this video, it asks children to share in their own words what domestic violence was to them. So thank you for your attention. I hope you all enjoyed this afternoon's webinar, and I'll put you on to Emma, who will take on after the video.
Sure.
We're worried that Mum might get killed.
We hope it will pass and things will be back to normal, but we are still scared thinking about when it will happen again.
It's a really bad. It is shouting, name-calling, crying, and sometimes even punches, bruises, and blood.
It gets louder and louder. They don't think we can hear, but we can, even if we're in the last corner of the house.
We're worried that Mum might get killed.
We hope it will pass and things will be back to normal, but we are still scared thinking about when it will happen again.
It's a really bad feeling in our heart. It feels like it's broken. Sometimes we feel it in our bodies too, and our bones start to hurt.
We find it really hard to stay out of it. We try to stop it, but it doesn't work.
It's our job to protect our little brothers and sisters.
Sometimes we are told whose side we're on. We don't like it.
Some adults think children are stupid, but all children have a voice.
Together, we can paint a better picture.
Thank you very much. So hopefully you can all see my screen share there. So what I'm going to do is talk in 3 parts. Firstly, about coercive control in general, what it is, how we can understand it, and what does and doesn't help in responding to it. And then a little bit about how children are impacted by coercive control while the mum and dad are still together. And then in the the last third of the talk, I'm going to really focus on post-separation abuse and how children, specifically children, experience the post-separation abuse that perpetrators often carry on with post-separation. So starting off then with understanding coercive control, I think it's really important to say that not all abusive or bad behavior in relationships is exactly the same. Not every slap or push or name calling is the same. To understand the behavior, we need to look at the motivation of the perpetrator, the patterns of behavior in the perpetrator, what they've been doing over a period of time, and the impacts of the behavior, what has happened as a result of the behavior. And coercive control is a very serious form of domestic abuse. I would describe it as being like the deep end of the pool of domestic abuse. It's very serious, and it's what we will focus on here today. And coercive control involves situations where somebody subjects another person to persistent controlling behavior and makes it clear that they're standing up for themselves, saying no, saying I don't like this, standing up for themselves will be punished. So the person is under this coercion because they know that if they don't do as they're told, they'll be punished. So the perpetrators set up a situation which is very much do what I say or else. The punishment that the perpetrator might choose to inflict may take many forms. It's not always violence, but it will be something that the victim dreads and the perpetrator knows they dread, like cruel verbal put-downs or hurting loved ones, including pets. By repeatedly punishing the victim for their non-compliance, the perpetrator hopes to demoralize and terrorize the victim into a state of permanent submission, where the victim is just doing what the perpetrator wants all the time, as though they have no rights of their own, no needs of their own, no life of their own. So hence, looking at the motivation of the perpetrator, that is what is motivating the perpetrator when there's coercive control. They're hoping to bring about a state where the victim is just compliant all the time and has no needs or rights of their own. Analysis of the crime survey for England and Wales by Andy Myhill in 2015 found that out of a group of women and men who ticked a box on the survey indicating they'd experienced some kind of domestic abuse, something had happened, 30% of those women and 6% of those men seem to have experienced abuse severe enough to be called coercive control. And in Myhill's analysis, he suggested that if the men and the women had ticked the boxes to say that they had been belittled to the point where they felt worthless, and their partner had made them fearful and had threatened to hurt them or someone they loved, then it was a fairly safe bet that they'd experienced coercive control. And of all the women and the men who reported that something bad had happened in their relationship, 30% of the women and 6% of the men had ticked those boxes on the survey. And research by Michael Johnson and colleagues in the US found that 22% of women had experienced coercive control from their ex-husbands post-separation, and 5.4% of men had experienced coercive control from their ex-wives. So we see from these figures that coercive control is mainly perpetrated by men, but there are a small minority of male victims and a small minority of female perpetrators. And this can also take place in same-sex relationships as well. So here I've tried to unpack some of the tools that perpetrators use in order to carry out their coercive control. And I'd like you to imagine that everything on this list, all of these bullet points, are tools in the perpetrator's terrible toolbox of coercive control. So the emotional and psychological abuse and the manipulation may be the hammer. The screwdriver may be the control of time and movement and how the perpetrator micromanages everyday life. Other tools will be sexual coerciveness and rape, paranoia about infidelity, intimate image and video abuse, and reproductive coercion. That is, making somebody have a child that they may not want to have, or making them not have a child that they may want to have. And then there'll be economic abuse, including interfering with the survivor's employment, preventing them from having money, refusing to contribute to bills, and creating debt for which victims and survivors are liable. There'll be isolation from sources of support, including family, friends, and professionals. There may be monitoring and stalking, manipulating others, including the children, to upset, marginalize, and disempower the victim and survivor. Using legal and institutional means to threaten, harm, or discredit the victim and survivor. And also, there may or may not be physical violence, intimidation, and threats of violence against the victim and survivor and their loved ones, including their pets and their property. Perpetrators don't always need to use violence to achieve what they want, which is this incredibly scared and compliant partner or child, but many of them do use violence, some don't. Evan Stark's book, which was a revolutionary book in our field, and if you haven't read it, I'd really recommend it, and it's called Coercive Control: How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life, argued that our responses to coercive control-based domestic abuse were failing female victims because they were wrongly seeing the domestic abuse as incidents or episodes of violence, as in the domestic abuse took place on Tuesday between 7 and 7:10 p.m, as though it's just these little incidents. And Stark says this is failing, and it's a problem because virtually all domestic violence research and intervention gets based on that idea. And this overlooks the fact that coercive control perpetrators are using many other abusive tactics besides physical violence. They're using emotional abuse, they're monitoring and micro-regulating, they're isolating, and they're economically abusing, and they are doing these things continuously. Victims and survivors are therefore being repeatedly or constantly abused, even if there's not been an incident of physical violence for months or ever. And I think it's important here to just spotlight the perpetrators, because so often they slip out of the spotlight, and we talk about them as though, well, sometimes we end up talking about domestic abuse as though it's as though there is no perpetrator. You know, women are at risk of abuse. Well, that spotlights the woman, but actually it's the perpetrator who's putting the woman at risk of abuse. We need to drag the perpetrator into the spotlight. So let's just think about perpetrators for a moment. They're charming at the beginning of the relationship to suck the victim in and gain their commitment. So at the beginning, the victim will feel like they've met their soulmate, they've met the one, that this will be the best relationship of their life, because the perpetrator is being very charming to make them think that. Then perpetrators use nice, romantic, and contrite behaviors from time to time to keep the victim locked into the relationship by giving them hope. But the fact that things are good in the relationship at the moment does not mean the abuse is over. It's part of the abuse. Perpetrators are very clever at excusing, justifying, and denying their behavior. They can present to others as kind and caring and normal, but this is very deceptive. They may be highly qualified and in a respected job. They may be a police officer. They may be a teacher, a head teacher, a solicitor, a politician, a celebrity. They may be your colleague. They're often good at recruiting allies. Perpetrators go about quite systematically recruiting allies, people who will be on their side and back them up. And they do this with family, friendship groups, workplaces, communities, and they're often good at turning professionals involved with the family into their allies by very carefully presenting a particular image of themselves. They often make counter accusations, such as she's crazy or she's alienating the kids from me. And they will use whatever tactics work best to gain and keep control, which is their goal. So perpetrators will often make a calculation in the moment. What will be better for me in terms of keeping my control and gaining more control? Is it better for me to be extra horrible right now, to be vile and abusive, to scare the life out of my partner? Is it better for me to just be a bit menacing? Is it better for me to be nice and buy some flowers? And they'll often be quite calculated in their behavior. Perpetrators tend to be extremely self-centered and often have a highly inflated sense of entitlement. Entitlement is so key to perpetrators. They believe their needs come first and that their partner and children should make pleasing them their absolute priority. Therefore, coercive control is not being caused by a toxic relationship, nor a bad relationship or a bad marriage, nor a turbulent relationship or anything like that. It's caused by the perpetrator's deeply held belief systems, attitudes, and expectations. Things that they will have held before the relationship and things that they'll still hold after that relationship, because this won't disappear when the relationship ends. It will remain very much in the perpetrator. So to put it simply, the problem is in the perpetrator. It's not in the relationship. And I've referenced here Monckton Smith. That's Professor Jane Monckton Smith, who's written a fantastic book about the mindset of perpetrators and the behavioral patterns of perpetrators called In Control. So I'd really recommend having a read of that, In Control by Monckton Smith. And then for adult victims, I think there's a lot of myths around adult victims which can get in the way of us identifying them. Especially, it's a myth that if a victim and survivor fights back or has less than perfect behavior herself, or if she's intelligent and seems confident and is from an affluent background, then there's a myth that she can't be a real victim because she fought back, or she seems too confident, she's too intelligent. Sometimes people will actually say to victims, you can't be a victim, you're a professional woman, this couldn't have happened to you. The reality is that victims come from all walks of life, and they are affected in different ways. Some victims fight back and some don't, depending on the context. Some maintain employment and to the outside world seem confident and successful, and to the outside world, they don't realize what the perpetrator is doing. Some turn to alcohol, medication, or drugs to try and cope with the perpetrator's abuse. Many become mentally unwell because of the perpetrator's abuse. They're all real victims. If you're experiencing coercive control, you are a real victim. And then I'd like to talk for a moment about the terms fighting and arguing, which we hear so often around domestic violence. But the terms fighting and arguing are actually really misleading and inaccurate when it comes to coercive control, because a fight or an argument sounds like something that both people are contributing to, and it sounds like the kind of thing that takes place in a kind of normal home. But with coercive control, anything that looks like a fight or an argument, what's actually going on beneath the surface is that the perpetrator is trying to impose coercive control on the victim. And they may be doing this by arguing about a particular issue, but it's not really about the issue. It's about, I demand control of you. And the victim, when they fight or argue back, is resisting this attempt to impose control over them. And this is a reasonable and psychologically healthy thing for the victim to be doing. So the fight might seem to be about something in particular, something that happened that day or the day before, but actually it's about these long-term patterns of the perpetrator trying to impose their control and the victim legitimately resisting that. Perpetrators may seem angry, very angry, but this isn't because they have a problem with anger. It's because they are enraged that the victim is resisting their control. So the root cause of their anger is their belief that they're entitled to have control. And that is what is creating this rage when they don't have as much control as they want. So the problem is with their belief that they're entitled to control, not with an anger problem. Abuse during a fight or an argument is done with a purpose. And you guessed it, it's control. Perpetrators often use abusive behaviors, shouting, put downs, threats, and violence to punish the victim for resisting their control. They use abuse to manipulate, belittle, and frighten their victim into becoming more submissive in the future. Westmoreland and Kelly have a really useful concept around coercive control, and it's the concept of space for action, which means our freedom to say and do things and to simply meet our own needs without worry or fear. And for people living, adults living in a democracy, we would expect to have a nice, healthy, big space for action. We would expect to be free to say and do things, within reason, and to meet our own needs without worry or fear as adults living in a democracy. But coercive control victims don't have that space for action, because as perpetrators micro-regulate victims' options and choices and ability to decide for themselves, shrink down more and more and more and more, until really the only choice that the victim is left with on a day-to-day basis is, what can I do that won't upset him? What can I do that won't make him retaliate? And living in this way, without freedom, without space for action, without autonomy, and without your own voice, without being able to say what you really think, can create profound disempowerment, loss of self, and loss of confidence. And we often see this in victims. One victim who I interviewed with, she said to me that having been used and abused day in, day out, being told that she was crap day in, day out, had such an impact on her that she said the self that she used to be before this had been erased, destroyed, and was gone. And post-separation, she said, I'm trying to find a new self, I'm trying to build a new self, and it's bloody hard. So because of this limited space for action, any intervention when we're responding to coercive control needs to do both one and two. Firstly, increase the victim's actual space for action. And the best thing we can do is get the perpetrator out of their space for action, because it's the perpetrator who's constricting it. So that might mean like legal interventions with the perpetrator, for example. We also need to perhaps do things like provide housing that enables them to leave, because if we're homeless, we don't have much of a space for action because we can't meet our own needs. It might involve helping them to get a job so they can support themselves financially, perhaps showing them how to pay bills, because perpetrators can, it's not unusual for them to target a victim from the age of 16, 17, 18, or perhaps, they met at university and they've been together since then. So the victim may have never lived on their own as an autonomous adult. So they may need support to know how to do that. But if you do that, you also need to do number two, increasing the victim's confidence and self-belief that they do have space for action and can use it wisely to manage their own life. Because when you've been denied that power to run your own life for a long time, taking up that power again, getting back in the driving seat of your life can be terrifying. So terrifying that we may not be able to do it without significant support. And I've done a little diagram here, very much inspired by Lundy Bancroft's 2002 book, Why Does He Do That?, about things that might be helpful and things that might be unhelpful and dangerous. And I just want to run through this with you. It may be helpful for the victim and survivor and their children to receive support from a specialist domestic abuse service. It may be helpful to see a strong criminal justice response that holds the perpetrator to account and makes the victim, survivor, and their children safe, though the chances of getting such a criminal justice response are pretty minimal, unfortunately. And it might be useful, possibly, for perpetrators to attend a lengthy and high quality perpetrator program that works with them to stop their belief that it's okay to abuse, as well as independently supporting the victim and survivor and providing them with their own worker too. And then the things that I've put on the other side here, the just leave approach. Why don't you just leave? Well, we know that leaving is the most dangerous time for victims because, of course, they've broken the perpetrator's control by daring to leave. So the perpetrator will be quite keen to seize back that control, and that can lead to an escalation in their violence and abusiveness. So leaving without a safety plan is dangerous. And of course, it's domestic abuse services who might be able to help with coming up with a safety plan. Sending anyone involved into drink or drug treatment may be unhelpful and dangerous because the drink or the drugs cannot possibly be the root cause of the coercive control. So you might get them sober, especially with the perpetrator, you might get them sober, but then what you'll have on your hands is a sober perpetrator who has a bit of paper saying they've completed treatment and are now safe, which can be dangerous because they may well not be safe at all. If drink was the root cause, for example, then we would see zero abusiveness from perpetrators when they were sober. So, for example, they would run their victims into debt when they were drunk, but then pay off the debt when they were sober, and then run them back into debt when they were drunk, and then pay off the debt again when they were sober. But we know they're not doing that. They're not paying off the debt when they're sober. if they're using economic abuse, they're hardly going to stop doing that when they're sober. So it's not the root cause, and hence tackling it without actually tackling the root cause, the perpetrator's beliefs that they're entitled to do this, that can be unhelpful and dangerous. It's the same with anger management, because anger management is not designed to change somebody's mindset about whether or not it's okay to be abusive. So it's just not designed to do what perpetrators need done. Couples therapy and family therapy can be incredibly dangerous because the victim may be lulled into a false sense of security in the office of the counsellor, and say things that the perpetrator will punish them for when they get home. And Bancroft has some really nasty, harrowing examples of that happening, the perpetrators attacking their victims after the session for what they said in it. And it's also not suitable because couples therapy and family therapy are kind of based on the idea that both parties are contributing to the problem. But in coercive control, it's only the perpetrator who is driving the problem. Similarly, if you send a perpetrator off to a therapist who isn't a specialist in abuse, the perpetrator with their hyper-entitled mindset will probably sit there saying, I'm so hard done by, my partner's so horrible to me. I had such a difficult childhood. I feel so this, that, and the other. And so in a way, it's almost encouraging the perpetrator's sort of narcissism and elevation of their own feelings, rather than getting them to concentrate on their behavior and the consequences that it's happening, that it's having. So just beware perpetrators seeing therapists who are not specialists in abuse. And similarly, it can be dangerous and unhelpful for the victim to see a specialist, say that again. It can be unhelpful for the victim to see a therapist who doesn't understand abuse, because they might say victim blaming things to the victim and set their self-esteem back a lot. They might say things like, well, why do you think you enjoy being abused? No, they don't enjoy being abused. They're trapped. The perpetrator has trapped them. Perpetrators, as I'm sure you know, often promise to change. And this is very common, and they often can extend their abuse for years and years and years by making promises to change and buy themselves years more time. So how can we assess whether change is real or is part of the manipulation? And I'm just signposting you here to this wonderful resource, Appendix D of this document. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. It provides a lovely checklist around, is the change real or not? Some very, very interesting questions. So now let's get on to talking about the impacts on children and young people. Research evidence from multiple countries highlights that male coercive control and domestic abuse perpetrators are usually harmful as fathers or father figures. And I've just put references to some of that research there. Domestically violent men tend to be hostile, coercive, demanding, and entitled fathers who are likely to have rigid and unreasonable rules, little patience, high expectations, and to use harsh forms of discipline. Perpetrators have elevated risks of physically, psychologically, and sexually abusing and neglecting the children in their care, and really quite significantly elevated risks. Perpetrators may also stalk, threaten, and terrorize their children as part of their abuse of ex-partners. And I'll talk more about that later in this talk. So I, a little while ago, did some research on this, which I'd like to share with you now. And I interviewed with 15 mums and 15 of their children who had all experienced coercive control and ultimately, by and large, escaped from it, although some were still suffering some post-separation abuse. But they were all living apart from the perpetrator in the community. The children who I interviewed with were between 10 and 14 years old for the most part, with the exception of one 20-year-old young man who still lived with his mum and wanted to take part. And the children had been 9 girls and 6 boys, and the perpetrator had been the father or the father figure in every case. And I put a reference to my research here. That's not behind a paywall, so you'll be able to download it, no problem. And then this is what I found. And this is quite tough going, so do look after yourself as you hear this. And if you need to kind of tune out, then do feel free to do so. Just take care of yourself. So firstly, I found that perpetrators were demanding high levels of attention from the mothers at the expense of the children, and they were stopping the mothers and the children from spending time together. My daughter Leah used to want me to sit and brush her hair, but that wasn't allowed because he'd be jealous. He'd say things like, "You've spent enough attention on her, what about my attention?" When Mum was giving me attention, he'd tell her to go over to him, so she'd have to leave me to play by myself. So here we can see the self-centeredness and high entitlement of the perpetrator and how that impacts on the children. And Shannon described how Shannon and her mum described the situation in more detail, and they said how the mum said how she hated having to leave Shannon to play by herself, but she had to comply because she knew what the perpetrator would do if she didn't. And Shannon described how when she was younger, she'd really hated this, and it had even made her wonder whether her mum loved her or not. And this form of coercive control was really limiting the amount of maternal attention that children could enjoy, and it was reducing opportunities for fun and affection in their home. Children described feeling sad and annoyed and angry at these situations. Now, when perpetrators' fathers controlled mothers' movements outside the home, this was also severely restricting children's social lives. It prevented children from engaging with wider family, peers, and extracurricular activities. The kids couldn't have any friends round because he'd kick off or something. Kids' parties were another problem because he'd be accusing me of trying to get off with one of the dads, so parties were out of the question. We couldn't do any after-school clubs because he insisted I had to be back by a certain time. Me and the kids weren't allowed to go round to see their grandparents. So here we can see that the multiple benefits that positive experiences with grandparents, friends, or in after-school clubs can have on children's social skills and confidence and development were being denied to these children by their fathers or stepfathers. Because of fathers' behaviours, many of the children were living in the same small, isolated, and lonely worlds as their mothers. And this was especially the case for younger children who were more reliant on mothers to facilitate their access to friends' houses, playgrounds, days out, etc. Some perpetrators used extreme tactics for depriving the family of freedom, independence, and resources, doing this very much to the children as well as the mothers. He would tell us that we couldn't touch the food in the fridge, that we weren't allowed to eat. He'd lock us in the house a lot of the time so we couldn't get out. He'd unplug the phone. He'd take out the power in the hall because we've got an old electric box where you can take things out and that's it. You've got no power. He used to take an element out of the central heating so we'd have no heating. He'd lock us in the house and go out. He'd take the modem so John couldn't do his homework and I couldn't do my banking on the computer. So we were prisoners in a way. And I think this really highlights how some fathers were directly and purposefully extending their coercive controlling abuse over their children as well as over their girlfriend or wife. Many children also had very limited freedom to say and do normal age-appropriate things at home, just to be kids at home. Children had to constrain their own natural behaviour to comply with their father's demands. When he came home from work, he'd want to spend time with them, and they were always his girls. He used to say to Zoe, "You're my little angel." But at the same time, they couldn't shout, they couldn't make noise, they couldn't be children around him unless it was on his terms. It was all right if he wanted to play with them, but at other times, it was like he wanted them to disappear. And sometimes perpetrators' negative moods could dominate homes to such an extent that children and mothers were literally prevented from laughing and having fun. As one mother described, laughing, we would have just been told to shut up. It was just a completely miserable experience. It was just angry and miserable and grumpy all the time. So there was just no fun in the house, no laughter. And this mother had only recently escaped from the perpetrator when I interviewed with her. And she described how in the few weeks since the escape, her children's personalities had started to emerge for the first time. And she said her 11-year-old daughter, who is Leah, who we heard she wasn't allowed to brush Leah's hair. Leah, her personality was coming out for the first time. And for the first time at the age of 11, Leah was starting to make jokes. And she'd never done that before, because of her father's incredible constraint upon the home. I also found that both children and mothers engaged in acts of resistance to the coercive control they experienced. Possibilities for resistance depended on the opportunities that children and mothers had under the particular regimes of coercive control that the fathers were imposing. And resistance often took the form of finding ways to maintain just a bit of normal life and a close mother-child relationship where possible, because coercive control is like an attack upon normal life, because normal life has to become all about pleasing the perpetrator, so it's normal life is just not happening. So it's not surprising that resistance is about just finding ways to reclaim a bit of normal life. We did things together. We went to the pictures or we went shopping, and there we could let our hair down and do what we wanted to do. We were going to the cinema 2 or 3 times a week to get out of the house. When we would come back with shopping bags, sometimes we had to hide them because he would go mad that I spent money on John. So we used to throw the bags over the hedge into the garden so he wouldn't see them. And I think a couple of interesting things here. You might be asking, where did they get the money to go to the cinema? Well, interestingly, it was the mother's own father, the child's grandfather, who was giving them money each week to do that. And I think he knew that something was not right at home, and that was his way of helping. And so they were using that money to promote their freedom and have a bit of relaxed time. And I also love this idea of hiding the shopping bags. I think that what might look like a plastic bag from Tesco can actually be a symbol of resistance, an act of resistance when you're living with coercive control. Well, some days he would be out, and then me and Mum would watch a movie and have some time together, which he wouldn't let us do when he was at home. And I used to help cook tea with my mum because I enjoy cooking, so we'd help each other. On those days when we were alone, we would snuggle up on the sofa and watch films together, and we always emotionally supported each other then. So mothers and children were finding these little opportunities to promote each other's well-being and reduce the negative impacts of the perpetrator's behaviour. And I think it's really interesting that by defying the control where possible, children and mothers were maintaining just a little bit of their autonomy, and it was preventing the perpetrator from gaining that total control over them that he was seeking. And I think these acts of resistance highlight that mothers and children were not passive. They did what they could do to fight back. And that might not have been very much, but whatever they could do, they tended to do. And mothers do tend, for the most part, to do what they can to keep their children as safe and okay as possible, though their ability to do this can be limited, A, by the father's determination to abuse in ways that harm the children, and also by the negative impacts that his abuse might be having on the mother. For example, she might have become severely depressed. But on the whole, mothers do tend to do what they can to keep their children as safe and okay as possible. And positive parenting from mothers has been found to be a major factor in helping children to cope with the domestic abuse. And as Mullender et al. Put it, mothers are cited more frequently by children who've lived with domestic abuse as their most important source of help than anyone else in their lives. Their relationship with their mother is most children's major support in coping. Mothers may need positive reinforcement in this role, which at present they rarely receive. So this is kind of what was going on pre-separation. And wouldn't it be absolutely lovely if leaving ended all of this, and then the mum and children could be free and there'd be nothing more to worry about? But we know that so often this is not the case because it continues post-separation. Because coercive control perpetrators don't tend to respect their partner's decision to end the relationship. They typically continue in their efforts to control and dominate their partner's life and/or punish them for trying to break free. And this means that most perpetrators of coercive control continue to harm their children post-separation. So I teamed up with researchers at the University of Lapland in Finland. Yes, that is a real place. When I first heard of it, I thought that sounds like the University of Santa Claus, because I'm used to thinking of Lapland being where Santa Claus is. But no, it is a real place. In fact, it's the most northernmost university in Europe. And with the researchers in Finland, we compared my data on children and coercive control with data they had gathered in Finland through interviews they'd done with Finnish children whose coercively controlling fathers had stalked both them and their mothers post-separation. So we drew on interview data with 29 children, the 15 I'd interviewed in the UK and 14 they'd interviewed in Finland who'd experienced this stalking from their fathers. And the key question we asked was, how did the children experience their fathers and father figures post-separation coercive control? And again, if you want to read about this, I've put the link. And again, that's not behind a paywall, so you'll have no trouble reading it. This is what we found. So some children described really scary behavior from their fathers, and we called this dangerous fathering. He used to bring some other men and try and break into the house, and me and my brothers feared for our lives because he used to smack on the doors and I used to hide. My dad's injunction ran out and he kept turning up at the house. Then he wrote something on the back door. He wrote, "Dead bitch." And my mum tried to get it removed before we could see it, but I saw it before it got removed. So this dangerous fathering could make children's and mothers' lives frightening and unpredictable. The father's actions here were really drastically limiting the safe space available to children and mothers, often leaving them feeling as though they were under siege in their own homes or in their own communities. Dangerous fathering undermined children's emotional and physical security and their well-being. We also found certain fathers were using what we termed admirable fathering as part of their ongoing attempts to control ex-partners. They often chose to present themselves as admirable fathers to school staff, other parents, and wider communities, both online and offline, and to professionals. The persona of the admirable father could include the father playing the role of being a caring, committed, and/or vulnerable victim father, a father deserving of praise and support. And this appeared to be part of perpetrators' strategies to increase their own power while further marginalizing and weakening their ex-partner. So, for example, 2 Finnish siblings described how their father had posed as a victim in need of help who had been wronged by his ex, and he broadcast on Facebook that their mother had kidnapped them. He had written on Facebook some kind of missing persons report, that whoever finds us or knows where we are, something like that, he'll pay 10,000 euros. Yeah, he claimed that our mother had kidnapped us and there will be a reward for the person who finds us. And what they'd actually done is fled to escape his stalking. And he put their pictures on Facebook, and this had the effect of turning every member of the public into a potential agent of the perpetrator. And of course, the mum and the children didn't know who had seen this on Facebook and who hadn't, and who might report them to their ex-partner. So they were fearful, particularly when out in public. Some perpetrators directed their performance of admirable fathering at the children, for example, by claiming to be vulnerable victims who needed their children's help. So Grace describes her father's behaviour during a court-ordered contact visit that they had with their father every weekend. He'd say, "Your mum makes me cry. Your mum makes me do this stuff. I can't see you because of your mum." And he just paints such a bad picture of her. He blamed her and us for everything. He said he was on antidepressants because I wasn't seeing him often enough. I felt very small and bad. After our weekend visit with our father, my sister Zoe would be off school most Mondays because she felt so ill. She was on the sofa being held by mum and crying. He would call my sister Zoe and say, "You're the only one who really loves me." I was just so drained and I felt like crying all the time. Here, this father was producing these guilt trips in his daughters, making them terribly upset and refusing to take responsibility for his own emotional state. By presenting himself as the vulnerable victim, he was coercing his daughters into maintaining relationships with him that were harmful to their well-being. By making his children feel as though they were responsible for his welfare, he was disguising the emotional power he was actually wielding over them. And Grace, who described this, eventually she'd seen a counsellor, and I don't know who this counsellor was, but I'd like to give them a medal, because the counsellor had helped her to see how manipulative all this was and made her see that she wasn't responsible for her dad and made her see that she had nothing to feel guilty or bad about. And Grace, who was probably about 12 at the time she saw this counsellor, then took the decision to stop seeing her dad, and her welfare really flourished after that. But of course, if Dad had wanted to, he could have dragged it back to the family courts, claimed that he was a victim of parental alienation and forced Grace to keep on seeing him. But at that point, he had a new partner, he'd fathered a new child with the new partner and was busy abusing them. So Grace was able to kind of slip away. Not good for the new partner and children, however. And many children experience their father as a constant negative presence in their post-separation lives, whether they saw him frequently or not. Because even if they didn't see him, they knew he was out there. They knew that there was nothing stopping him from coming into contact with them. And this left children in a continual state of anxiety and worry, and it was still harming their ability to live normal lives. Children often feared that they might encounter their father and be harmed by him. They were fearful they could be kidnapped by him. And this could lead to panic attacks, bedwetting, and nightmares. Some children described how even years later, post-separation, years into the post-separation period, they were still really frightened. I have to check it so that the doors are locked and the windows are closed. And children were also trying to increase their own and their mother's security by remaining with her. So, for example, a 12-year-old boy described how, now sometimes I'll sleep in my mum's bed because I feel comfortable there and I feel more safe sleeping there. And obviously it's not really normal for a 12-year-old boy to be in his mum's bed, but that's how scared his dad had made him over the years. And it was sometimes even that we weren't able to go to school. I didn't want to leave my mum alone for the day. And although I don't have a quote about it here, this child, Rusa, described how her and her sibling, when they went to school, and if mum had gone to work, they were terribly worried about the pets who'd been left behind at home, and they were worried that they might come home and find that the father had gained entry into the house and killed their pets, which I suspect had probably happened at one point for them to be so worried about it. So yeah, it was very tough for children post-separation when they knew that their father could crop up at any time, and they knew there was just nothing stopping that from happening. My Finnish colleagues and I also explored court cases in Finland pertaining to fathers stalking mothers post-separation. And we analysed court files of these cases. And again, findings highlighted the father's frequent use of the children in their campaigns of post-separation coercive control. And I'm just going to share with you 5 quotes from some of these court files, again highlighting how perpetrators can be absolutely ruthless in sacrificing their child's well-being in order to continue their campaign of coercive control. So this is all quotes from the court files. The perpetrator threatened the child in his messages to the mother. If you tell the police, then I will change the game, so the child is the one who has to be afraid. In the first summer of our separation, when the child was at his place, he sent me a message, book the church for Sunday, because I will probably kill the child today. During the child's weekend visits with the father and at other times, the perpetrator has, via the child's own phone, threatened to come to his ex-wife's home and abuse her and her new partner. In the presence of the child, he has threatened to kill the mother by shooting her and warned that she and her new partner would be attacked by his friends who have criminal records. The child has said many times to the father that she or he does not like his behaviour, but he hasn't stopped. And then this is from a witness. Last summer, we were with the woman and her children in an amusement park, and she got messages incessantly The worst of the messages was that the perpetrator was threatening to kill himself. He also sent the same kinds of messages to the children, putting the blame on the mother for how he was about to do something to himself. And then this last one is from a mother who describes how the child came to ask me on Friday morning, "Ugh, why am I receiving these kinds of photos of you?" The child couldn't connect the messages to the father because she or he didn't have his phone number. I looked through the messages and I saw that the sender was my ex-partner. He had previously demanded that I take photos of a sexual nature of me and send them to him. And now he has sent these photos and videos to my child. Hence why the child was saying, "Ugh, why am I getting these photos of you?" So again, perpetrators we see in these quotes can be absolutely ruthless in using the children as part of their campaign of post-separation coercive control, with seemingly absolutely no care or interest in how their behaviour might be affecting the child. So to conclude then, coercive control is a really severe form of abuse, and perpetrators of coercive control cause high levels of harm. So I'd just like to point out that, as far as I know, I don't think in any of the quotes I mentioned there did I mention any incident of actual physical violence. I don't think I mentioned the children actually seeing violence, the perpetrator actually attacking anybody, although of course this was happening as well. But all the stuff I mentioned was the non-violent stuff. It was all part of the coercive control: the stalking, the threats, the constraint on time, the constraining of time and movement, stopping you from living normal life. And all of that, as you can see, is causing high levels of harm. And then if you add violence into the mix as well, there's even more harm. Coercive control perpetrating fathers tended to parent their children in these negative ways and subject their children to coercive control in ways that profoundly harmed the children's day-to-day experiences of life. And the adult victim separating from the perpetrator is unlikely to be enough to make the children safe, as the perpetrator usually continues their coercive control post-separation. They don't always, but quite often they do. And because the problem lies within the perpetrator, tackling the problem means tackling the perpetrator, holding them accountable, crucially curbing their ability to continue abusing, and doing that with as much zeal and determination as possible, because the perpetrator is very determined to carry on. So you have to be even more determined to put in place interventions that will stop them. And helping the adult and child victims to be safe. And I mean really safe, not safe on paper, because so often victims and adult victims and child victims have been told that they were safe because they'd separated. It was considered that they were safe. You know, files have been closed down. It was considered that they were safe because they'd separated, but they were not safe. They didn't feel safe. And I think the real measure of safety is asking somebody, how safe do you feel? Do you feel safe? Are you still fearful? You know, to what extent do you feel free and safe and able to enjoy just normal life, being able to go out for a walk in your community, being able to sit at home and not be feeling fearful? And I think that's the real measure of safety, rather than a sort of tick boxy measure of it. Okay, so just before I wrap up, a few last things to say. Firstly, if anyone wants to email me, I'm available to provide bespoke training on domestic abuse or coercive control. So if you're sitting there and you're thinking, I wish my team could hear this presentation, do feel free to drop me an email and we can have a talk about that. I'd like to just do a bit of shameless self-publicity here and let you know that my book will be published in about 6 months' time. It's called Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, and it will be including the stuff I've talked about here today, but also so much more, and also some very positive things as well. The book also talks about mums and children who have found their light at the end of the tunnel, made it to a much happier place, and how they managed that and how it felt for them. So it's not all doom and gloom. So keep an eye out for that. It will be out in about 6 months, probably in the early summer. These are my previous publications. Feel free to email me if you want a copy of any of them. I'm happy to send them to you. These are the references that I've used today. You can see I've been drawing on a whole wealth of research. There's plenty of research out there about this. And thank you very much for listening. I really hope that was useful. And lastly, if you're interested in following me on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, I'm quite active on Twitter, so it's a good way of keeping in touch and hearing more about my research work as it progresses. And I'm on Twitter at Dr. Emma Katz, so feel free to follow me there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. It's amazing. Emma, can I ask before we start the Q&A, just someone was asking there, could we get the slides to send around with the recording afterwards?
Oh, yes, of course.
Okay, brilliant. I'll hand over to Olive there. Can you see the Q&A, Olive? You're on mute.
Thanks very much, Kathleen. I can see them. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Yeah, Emma, that was really powerful, and so much content in it, and so much useful guidance for us as well in terms of other references to access. So we have a number of questions that have come in, and I'm going to just take them in order as they've come. So the first question is, how can we support families where a mother's mental health or addiction becomes the core issue and the DVA gets minimised, especially with post-separation abuse?
That is a very good question, and I know that that's a big problem and that happens quite a bit. So I was just talking to some social work students about this the other day, and let me just do a screen share of a very nice journal article which tells you kind of what to do about this. So this journal article is called Evidencing Better Child Protection Practice, Why Representations of Domestic Violence Matter. And it's about how you can write your reports in such a way that you can bring the coercive control to the fore and try and get the other professionals involved with the case to understand that the coercive control is the core issue, and you can kind of avoid writing reports in ways that kind of accidentally make it seem as though the mental health or the addiction issues are the core issues when they're not really. So do have a look at this article. It's on ResearchGate, so I'm hopeful that you'll be able to access it for free. But if not, just drop an email to either of the authors. You can see their names down there. It's a really good article. If anyone can't get hold of it, you can also email me and I can send it to you. But it has some wonderful little case studies and case examples of what to do. And it just explains how you can write your report in such a way that you can hopefully get other professionals to understand what the core issues are, and you can get it on paper. This is, you know, the core issue is the coercive control, and it's the perpetrator who's done that.
Thanks, Emma. That's a really good reference for us. The next question is around when working with post-separation abuse, the child's voice is so often lost. And this a comment that the work by yourself is just so powerful. So how can we help protect these children and give them a voice when cases are so often closed to services because the children are no longer living with the perpetrator?
Oh, I wish I knew how you could do that.
We're asking for all your wisdom, Emma, here today, I think.
I mean, there's programs that support children post-separation. I know Barnardos runs a version of that program. In England, it's run as something called DART, Domestic Abuse Recovering Together. In Scotland, it's run as something called CEDAR, Children Experiencing Domestic Abuse Recovery. I think that stands for, yeah, CEDAR. So I think you do have that in Ireland, because I was hearing about that recently.
And sorry not to get across you there, absolutely. And Yvonne referred to it in her introduction as it's the TLC KIDZ program that we deliver here in North Tipperary, an interagency delivered program, and it's delivered in a number of different areas around the country.
So I know that's a good thing. But I mean, yeah, it's so difficult. I mean, I think we need to do as much as possible to curb the perpetrator's ability to keep doing this. So, you know, I guess it's about pushing for like non-molestation orders or anti-stalking orders or whatever the equivalent legislation you have in Ireland is, so that the perpetrator is prohibited from coming near the victim and hopefully also the children. And I guess it's also about trying to, again, write reports in such a way that you make it as clear as possible that this person poses a risk to the children still post separation because of their attitude towards the children and their willingness to use the children as part of the coercive control and their track record of having done this. So I guess just trying to flag those issues up as much as possible. But it's very tricky, especially with the family courts being the way they are at the moment, because the family courts tend to promote the children still having contact with the perpetrator, almost no matter how bad that perpetrator's behavior is, the family court will still want the child to have contact. So that is a big obstacle to these children being safe at the moment, and that I can't really sort of advise around that, because it's such an obstacle, and unless we can get judges to make different decisions, it's going to continue to be an obstacle. I think someone in the chat was just asking you to say the name of that program again, the TLC KIDZ
program. Yes, yeah, it's hosted by Barnardos in some areas, and in other areas hosted by domestic violence services. But the important thing is that it's where whoever hosts it, it's an interagency delivered program. But what I know services are finding around the country at some stages is that the referrals to the program is much lower than I suppose anticipated, because of what services are seeing around the presentation of domestic violence in cases. So I think that's maybe as well thinking of the first question there about us, how we can kind of safeguard children getting lost because maybe they've come out of a child protection because they're no longer living with the perpetrator.
I know we need to design a whole different system, because at the moment our system is designed around the idea that separation equals safety, and it doesn't. And so we need pathways in place to tackle the perpetrators post separation and make sure that they don't keep on doing this. And we just don't have those pathways really at the moment. So it's so difficult what you can do as individuals, because you're just working in a system that isn't set up really to do that.
Absolutely. Emma, the next question then is around recovery of children living with DVA, so important, but this trauma is often not seen, and what is the best approach to do this? So I suppose that will be helpful for us in terms of.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, although they're children, they're coercive control victims. And so the last thing you want to do with a coercive control victim is control them or coerce them. So be really careful to be non-threatening with them, non-coercive, and in fact do the exact opposite. Give them as much choice as you can do. Let them choose, let them decide, and let them know that you respect their opinion, because that could be incredibly powerful for them. Because you, in a sort of position of authority relative to the child, if you give them the message their feelings are important, their voice is important, what they think is important, what they want is important, that is the complete opposite of the message that dominated their childhood when the perpetrator was there. So I think just that approach itself can be very empowering for the child, and of course for the adult as well. It's the same thing for the adult. And yeah, I think that children in these circumstances need to know that it wasn't their fault, they were not to blame, their victim parent wasn't to blame either. The responsibility for the behavior lies with the person doing the behavior, in this case, their perpetrating parent. That doesn't mean that they have to hate their parent. It doesn't mean that they should stop loving them or anything like that. But I think it is important to to let them know that that person was responsible for their own behavior, and it wasn't their fault as a child. It wasn't their mum's fault. I think that's a really powerful message, because perpetrators often have told the children that it's their fault or sent out that message. So yeah.
And we see that so often in the work, both with the children and with the women who've been abused, is that sense of self-blame and taking on that responsibility, and it is such a key.
And I would also, I think it's my view that it's important to help these children to recognise what is healthy parenting and what is unhealthy parenting, because so often the perpetrator is manipulating them post-separation, as we saw with Grace, for example, making them think it was their job to look after him, sometimes we see perpetrators, I didn't have a quote about this, but we see sometimes perpetrators will buy the children lots of presents because they've been financially abusing the victim for years. So they have way more money than the victim post-separation because they've kind of been gobbling up all the victim's money. So the victim hardly has any money to spend on the children and the perpetrator has loads. So then they lavish loads of gifts on the children, and the children can then think, you know, well, the perpetrator parent is better and more fun and loves me more because they're buying me all this stuff. Not all children would think that, but I know some do. So just teaching them to recognize, you know, what is good parenting? What is healthy parenting? You know, what is good, you know, what is it acceptable for my parent to say to me and what isn't it, you know, and just so we're giving, kind of cluing them up and empowering them to be able to recognize not just like healthy and unhealthy relationships, because we're kind of used to the idea now of teaching children about healthy and unhealthy relationships so that they, you know, hopefully this will protect them later on, but also healthy and unhealthy parenting so that they can see through some of the strategies the perpetrator is still using to manipulate them.
Okay, and Emma, in your presentation you talked about some of the ways, do you know, that we can support children and women, and you talked obviously about perpetrator programs, and obviously sort of sometimes that men may not be suitable for perpetrators programs. For a lot of the audience here today, there will be people both in statutory and voluntary agencies that are working with children and working with children and families. So what kind of message might you give to all of us in terms of how we work with men who are abusive in a maybe family support context?
Well, I would say read Lundy Bancroft's book, Why Does He Do That? It's a really good book. It's all about the mindset of the perpetrator. There's an especially good chapter, I think it's chapter 14, about the process of change in perpetrators and what that looks like. And fundamentally, you're trying to get the perpetrator to change their whole mindset, because they're in a mindset where they think it's acceptable to behave in these ways. They're in a mindset where they think they're entitled to behave in these ways and they're justified in behaving in these ways. And that's what you have to shift ultimately. So they no longer think it's acceptable and they no longer think it's okay. And that is incredibly hard to actually pull off. And some perpetrators are not suitable to even attempt that with, and others you attempt it with and it doesn't work, and perhaps some it does have some impacts and they do shift their mindset a bit, but it's not a magic wand, and I don't think we should ever assume that these men are that they're 100% safe because they've completed a perpetrator program, because it's not a magic wand. Even the best programs don't bring about change completely, but yeah, you're trying to shift their mindset so they no longer think it's acceptable to be abusive. And like I say, I'd really recommend Lundy Bancroft's book, Why Does He Do That? It's called Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Abusive Men. Okay,
thanks so much. Emma, the next is an observation from Tracy Costello, and then also it's a question. So Tracy's working with a nearly 17-year-old boy who uses tactics towards staff in a children's residential setting. And is it likely that his behaviour is learned from DV at home before being taken into care, as this hasn't been addressed within the family? If there are huge elements of trauma, addiction, however, his behaviour is hugely troubling for Tracy, considering he is in a relationship with another young person in care. And Tracy really felt that when you named that the perpetrator doesn't have an anger issue, but is enraged by resistance to the behaviour, and which she's experienced in several occasions. Not all of this question can be addressed, but regarding post-separation, is there data suggesting that the children can carry on the cycle of abuse as a response of the trauma, and perhaps not feeling safe, or because they are gaslighted to believe their mother or mother figure is weak and wrong for leaving the relationship? So quite a lot.
Yeah. Yes, all of that. Yes, I mean, not all children do carry on the cycle, and certainly not all boys do, but some do. And obviously, if you're seeing that, you know, in this young man, it's a good bet that he has learned this, you know, as part of his childhood. So yeah, I think that all of that requires a sort of perpetrator-focused intervention to unpick all of that he's learned from his childhood, and and try and replace it with some healthier ideas, which I know is a lot easier said than done.
Okay.
And yeah, and we do. I saw somebody just say in the chat that you're seeing this in the relationships of very young people, and indeed this can be happening in the relationships of 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds. You don't necessarily have to be living with somebody to do this to them, especially these days via phone technology. So this can start incredibly young, and it's quite similar for young people. It can also be happening in the relationships of very elderly people as well. We often miss it in the relationships of elderly people because we think, oh, that can't be happening because they're so elderly. But this can be happening in the relationships of 80-year-olds. They might have been together 50 years and this was happening all the way through, or it might be a fairly recent relationship, but look out for it in all age groups, you know, basically from 13 to 105.
Yes. And Emma, is there data about maybe where domestic abuse is carried on in the next generation? Is there anything you could point us to whether there is existing data?
Yes. So I mean, there is. I'm gonna just pop something into the chat for you, seeing as you want. I can't say like off the top of my head.
Yes. Yeah.
I can't recall just now because it's not quite my area of expertise, but I do have this, so let me pop that into the chat. I think that I saw somebody else saying in the chat, is there anything about children being coercively controlling towards parents? I haven't seen much yet, but probably there will be in the next couple of years. I think it can happen that way round, especially sons being coercively controlling towards mothers, but in other manifestations as well. I think so. That's I just popped that into the chat. That's a paper about the intergenerational transmission of violence, basically children picking up the cycle and carrying it on. That's a really good paper. Again, if anyone can't get hold of that, you can feel free to email me and I can send it you.
Thanks so much, Emma. Just what somebody's asking, what signs can we look for in children living with post-separation abuse? They may not have been through the services, and I suppose particularly for maybe teachers, doctors, or somebody who may be meeting those children.
Well, yeah, I guess I think it's about asking them gently, like, you know, is there anything that's making them feel kind of scared, anxious? Is there anything that they're worrying about that is, you know, that's stopping them from doing the things they want to do? You know, one of the girls I interviewed said that she'd not been able to go to dance lessons because she was afraid that her dad would turn up in the building and kidnap her. So yeah, I guess it's about asking them, you know, are there things that are kind of preventing you from sort of living the life that you want to live? Are there things that you're worried about? Are there things that your mum's worried about? I mean, the different things that could be going on for those children are so varied. You know, they could be angry, they could be aggressive, they could be withdrawn, they could be terrified, they could be perfectionists and seem to be doing really, really well, because some children respond to this by being academic super achievers and people pleasers. So they're absolutely charming to talk to and they look like they're thriving, but inside they're horrendously anxious and concerned and have very low self-esteem. So I don't think that it's necessarily because this is really quite common. If you're worried about a child, it's always worth sort of asking them about their, you know, the behavior of their parents who've split up, and if there's anything that's worrying them.
Yeah, that's the really strong message that's coming across all the time, isn't it? It's about giving the time to talk and to listen to both children and women. And I think if there's one thing we take away from, of the many things we'll take away from today, it'll be that it's about the importance of taking that time. There's a question here that asks, can fathers be victims of coercive control, and are there statistics around this, if you know, Emma?
Yes, absolutely. So what most studies on domestic violence, what they do is they ask about like experiences of being hit. And very few studies have really differentiated between hitting and coercive control. So we're still kind of in our infancy, we're still kind of at the infancy of understanding what is what is coercive control and what isn't, and how prevalent coercive control is, because not all cases where there's hitting or verbal abuse are cases of coercive control. But this is a slide that I showed at the beginning. I know people were still coming in at this point, so perhaps not everyone saw them, but out of a group of women and men who'd experienced some kind of domestic abuse, as reported on the crime survey for England and Wales, the data suggested 30% of those women and 6% of those men had experienced domestic abuse severe enough to be called coercive control. And Johnson found that 22% of women had experienced coercive control from ex-husbands, and 5.4% of men had experienced coercive control from ex-wives. So there definitely are some male victims of coercive control out there, nowhere near the numbers of female victims, but there are some out there, certainly. So you will find some cases from time to time where there's a male victim and a female perpetrator, and the perpetrator is the mother. And there's not much research into that so far. But I suspect that a lot of what I've said would apply if it was that way around. Similarly, when we looked at the stalking cases in Finland, there have been 138 cases where one parent had stalked the other post-separation, and there have been 138 of those cases that have gone before the Finnish courts in the period we were looking at, which was 2014 to 2017. And out of 138 cases, 131 cases, it was the father who was the stalker, but there were 7 cases where the mother was the stalker. So again, it's largely male perpetrated, but there are handfuls of male victims out there, certainly, yeah. So if you think you've got one on your hands, you probably have. But also do beware that perpetrators often pose as the victim. So ask some probing questions, because perpetrators often pose as the victim. So we do need to be very careful about that.
And you talked earlier, Emma, about the perpetrator who can present as the admirable father, and I think we all identify with families we've worked with where maybe that's really been how agencies have seen the family, of that the father is the strength within the family. So I suppose again, and I know you've talked a little bit as well, I suppose anything that we can do as professionals to kind of support against us being manipulated by perpetrators.
Well, I think, yes, somebody's just said in the chat, Darvo, deny that you were abusive, launch a counter-attack against the real victim, and reverse the victim and offender order. We see a lot of perpetrators doing that. It wasn't me, it was them. They've done this, and this to me. So guarding against that, well, I mean, what you're looking for is one person will have had the power and the control, and one person won't have. So one person will have been free to live the kind of life they wanted to live. They will have been able to go to the places they wanted to go. They will have probably been in charge of the family's money. The other person will have been living in an impoverished state, probably, where they were having to account for every penny they spent, or expected to pay all the bills, or they've been put into debt by the perpetrator. So I'd say a fairly reliable indicator is who's got the most money, because it would be quite difficult for the victim to have more money than the perpetrator. I find that quite extraordinary. It probably happens from time to time. But yeah, I think that, yeah, look at, and also I think victims will have experienced huge amounts of self-doubt and self-blame, and they will have been on a big journey to get to the place they are today in terms of their understanding of what's happened. So a victim will be able to describe how perhaps they initially thought about it this way, but then over time their thinking changed, and today they think about it in a different way. They will be able to describe how they kind of lost their identity as part of this. They hardly even knew what they liked or disliked. They just had to do what they were told. They were kind of voiceless. So I think a perpetrator will probably have a tough time mimicking all of that and claiming to be the victim, because the perpetrator will be very sure of themselves, and they'll probably shout quite loudly about how they're the victim, and be quite determined in putting that narrative forward. Whereas real victims tend to be pretty confused and still be kind of half blaming themselves a lot of the time, depending on what stage they're at. And if they're not doing that, then they'll be able to describe a time when they were doing that not so long ago and how they overcame that.
And Emma, somebody's put a question into the chat about working with somebody who's uncertain about whether they're being abused, and about maybe what supports to give them around working this out and realizing the abuse.
Yeah, I suppose it's about asking them to what extent they're free to live the kind of life they want to live. You know, going back to that concept of space for action, to what extent can they meet their own needs without worry and fear? And if that's a big struggle, if just doing the most basic, ordinary day-to-day things is causing them a lot of worry and fear because they're worried about how their partner's going to react, and they might think it's all their fault and that they're doing the wrong things and they're provoking their partner, and they might tell you that. But yeah, if they're worried about how their partner's going to react to just ordinary day-to-day things like going to the shops, meeting a friend for coffee, chatting on the phone to their mum, then that's not normal. You know, they're living in a very constrained space for action. Their partner is not respecting their freedom, their independence, their human rights, not respecting them as another human being, but rather seeing them more like a piece of property. So I would just explore all of that with them and get them to see just how squashed things have become, and reassure them that kind of squashing isn't normal. I think sometimes in relationships we think it's kind of our job to please our partner and do what our partner wants. Especially women tend to think that because they've kind of been told that from our society. It's kind of given them the message that it's kind of their job to make the relationship work and compromise and do what they need to do to keep things on track. But if that's at the expense where you can't even do basic ordinary things without worry about how your partner's going to react, that's gone far too far. That's become abuse.
Okay. And Emma, when you spoke about what might help and particularly what might not help, and you talked about the importance of therapists who are working with families where domestic abuse is an issue, having the skills and training. There's a question here in relation to, are there any training programs in Ireland, and you may or may not know, for therapists who may want to work with adults in the area of domestic abuse, or any reading outside of what had already been suggested that might be helpful?
So as for services, I'm not sure, but I do know that there's a woman called Laura Cahill, I believe. Let me just double check. And I know she's talking about training, because I've had a chat with her about this and talking about making training available. I'm just going to check I'm spelling her name right, because if I'm not, then that's pointless. One sec. I know I've got an email from her somewhere, so I'm just checking because it will bring up her name.
And Emma, while you're searching for that, just loads of comments in about just how powerful the presentation has been. Lots of comments from people about that. And
oh, thank you. And also I'm going to just find something and pop it in the chat, which is a really good PhD thesis about the kinds of support that is helpful to survivors in the long term to help them rebuild from all of this. And I had the privilege of reading this thesis, and I just want to pop that in the chat for you as well. I've lost my ability to spell. Can't talk and spell at the same time. That's the PhD thesis, Growth After Intimate Partner Violence, and it's about the kinds of support that is helpful long term. It's ever so good. And it also it talks about supports that are helpful for ethnic minority women as well, which is very useful. And yes, and it is Laura Cahill. I've just tracked it down. So you could always have a look at, you could always follow her on Twitter, because she's on Twitter, and I know she's in Ireland and she's talking about training for therapists around all this.
Okay, thanks so much, Emma. I could see that we're coming to the end of time, and I'm going to hand us back to Kathleen.
Oh, I'm just told in the chat that Dawn Hennessy is providing professional supervision for counsellors who want to work with survivors. So that's in the chat as well. I don't know Dawn, but that's a tip from the chat.
Okay, thanks so much, Emma.
Thank you, Emma. Thanks so much. That was amazing. And we're getting great feedback there. And thanks to everyone for attending today. And it's great to give that awareness around, you know, how perpetrators can manipulate systems and professionals to further control victims. And as Emma said in Twitter a few weeks ago, it's important to be domestic violence informed rather than just trauma informed. It's good to have the piece around domestic violence informed as well. And the power of interagency work, and there's a lot of professionals here that we work with here in Tipperary and further that are, you know, the power of working together and not having just siloed responses. And so thanks a million, and I hope this has increased your knowledge on the subject and you've got some resources there. And finally, thanks to Tusla as well for their ongoing collaboration and support. Okay, thanks very much, folks.
Bye.
Thanks, Emma. Bye.
Bye.